For me, this is an amazing day, and I just want to take one moment of personal privilege, to get to recognize Billy and bring the next gentleman out is something I never thought I'd be able to have so much incredible opportunity to be grateful to two such amazing people in my life at the same time. I did want to mention one thing. I did have to edit Brian's letter. He said, although Dad gave him an envelope, there was not much money in it. This really is a moment that I have long awaited for, an opportunity to not only thank one of my oldest and dearest friends, but provide him a chance to speak to all of you. Ted Nee and I have known each other for more than 40 years. We have trained together. We have fought fires together. We studied and promoted together. We served as command officers, company officers, and we taught together during those 40 years. We have been friends in the best and worst of times, often disagreeing, often challenging one another, but always protecting, defending, and supporting one another. Ted is the epitome of a good friend. But today, I want you all to also know that he is one of the most accomplished and the most educated and most elegant fire instructors alive. Ted has the experience to speak with erudition on virtually any topic in the fire service related to structural firefighting, decision-making, or perhaps more than any other alive today in the use of simulations and training. If you want a role model, look to Ted. If you want authenticity, look to Ted. If you want decency, kindness, and unblemished integrity, look to Ted. Ted's a 34-year veteran of the fire service and emergency services. He began his fire service career with the Albuquerque, New Mexico Fire Department, where he served in virtually every capacity. He retired as the Deputy Chief of Operations. In 2007, he joined the Emergency Response Organization at Sandia Laboratories. He left in 2015 to focus on building simulations and teaching fire simulations. He is now back with the Albuquerque Fire Department developing programs. Ted is the co-author of Fire Dynamics with Dan Madrikowski and John Cirillo. He is the author of the monthly online simulation for fireengineering.com. He has been married to Carol, a fellow educator and equally impressive talent and intellect for more than 30 years. He is a native of Boston, and he now resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ted is one of the most important people in my life. We often talk about who do you talk to. Dan DeGrice talked to us yesterday. For me, it's Ted. When I was first diagnosed with cancer in 1995, I didn't call my mom. I didn't call my wife. I called Ted, because I know on the other end of the phone I would hear, I'm on my way. And he was. We met at a little Mexican restaurant. And I knew he would say, oh, quit feeling sorry for you. You're going to be fine, you jackass, which is what he said. And he said, and it's prostate, not prostrate, you dope. I said, my prostrate is broken. So anyway, which I needed to hear. And later on, after I was better, Ted said, because he let me know I wasn't going to die, he said, oh man, I thought you were going to kick the bucket. He truly is that guy. He's the guy that Dan spoke about. He's one of the most beautiful people in the fire service. He truly is. I really hope you all take the chance to get to know him after you meet him today. I hope you get the chance to bring him to your organization. You'll never find a better man on the face of the planet. Allow me to introduce to you one of the finest men I've ever known, and to whom I will be eternally grateful for so many, many reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, Chief Ted Nee.
Thank you so much for the kind words, Bobby, my old friend. I also want to thank the folks who are behind the curtains here at the main program. They've made this really a seamless process for me. This year marks a milestone in my career. This is my 20th year presenting here at FDIC. So if you hang around long enough, they'll let you talk in the big room. Your time will come, Chief Canterman. When Chief Alton asked me to speak at this year's conference, I had to decide on a topic that I could cover in just 20 minutes. And if you attended my workshop on Monday, you know I could talk about training all day. So here I am at the start of my career in my recruit class graduation picture. And I thought, what's the one thing about training that I know now that I wish I knew back then? And what immediately came to mind was a training technique called deliberate practice. Now, while I was searching through an old hard drive trying to dig up this picture of my recruit class, I came across another old photo. In the class that was right after mine was a young, fresh-faced Bobby Halton. But back to my recruit class. Our instructors were veteran fire officers, most of whom had served in the military. And the thinking was, well, if they'd been through boot camp, then they should know something about training. None of them had any background in instructional methodology. They just did the best that they could to prepare us to fill the position of firefighter as it existed back in 1980. Now, I'm showing you this picture for a reason, and I'm going to get back to it in a few minutes. Before I get to deliberate practice, I need to discuss another training concept that puts deliberate practice into perspective. Back in the early 80s, two brothers, Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus, both of whom were professors at the University of California, Berkeley, were conducting research for the Air Force on the effectiveness of pilot training. One of the things that came out of that research was this 5-stage model of skill acquisition. What the Dreyfus brothers found was that for any skill that you're trying to master, you generally progress through these 5 stages. When I graduated from the fire academy, I was a novice. I had what the Dreyfuses described as know-what knowledge. I knew what I was taught, but I had no practical experience in the real world. I had to rely on my training, my department's SOPs, and most importantly, the direction of my company officer. After being out on the job for a while, getting a few fires under my belt, and a whole bunch of EMS responses, I began to relate the things I learned in recruit school with the things that I experienced out in the field. I was at what's called the advanced beginner stage. At the competent stage, you're no longer prone to making rookie mistakes. You can apply what you've learned to solve problems. You may not be the fastest, and you may not be the most skilled, but you can get the job done. The next 2 skill levels, proficient and expert, mark a significant change in how we experience a situation. An example of operating at the proficient level is the ability to quickly and accurately size up a structure fire. At the proficient level, you can read the critical cues, the building construction, the fire conditions, radio reports from crews, and recognize what those cues mean and react appropriately. For example, for this incident here, Engine 1's on the scene of a medium-sized 2-story apartment building. We have a working fire on the 2nd floor, side alpha, of a middle occupancy with possible extension into the attic. Engine 1 is securing a water supply, stretching a line through side alpha. We're in the offensive strategy. Engine 1 has command, hold the current assignments. Experts see the world through the filter of all their prior experience. They've progressed from following abstract rules to skilled behavior based on the concrete experience and the unconscious recognition of new situations as similar to previous ones. This is a progression from know-what knowledge to know-how knowledge. Now, at a minimum, we'd want people to be at the competent level. And ideally, it would be great if everyone was an expert. But for most of us, reaching the proficient level is a much more realistic goal. In general, it takes about 10 years to progress through these 5 stages. Given the right circumstances and training, you can progress quickly through the first 3 steps, but it takes time to acquire the necessary experience to reach the proficient and expert levels. It often takes as much time to go from the proficient stage to the expert level as it takes to get from the novice to the proficient level. Which brings us back to my recruit class. Every time you learn a new skill, you start back at step 1 as a novice. A few of my classmates spent their entire careers as firefighters, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But the majority of us went on to be driver operators, company officers, battalion chiefs, and eventually a few of us went on to be staff chiefs. Some went into the dispatch center, some went or got sent to paramedic school, and others went into the fire marshal's office. We didn't have 10 years in each of those positions to become experts, which leads us to one of the toughest problems in the fire service. How do we get people up to speed as quickly as possible? That brings us to the main topic of discussion, deliberate practice. The term deliberate practice was coined by a Florida State University professor, Anders Ericsson, to describe a specific way of training. His initial research into why some people excelled in a given field while others didn't led him to a lifelong study of expertise. His initial research involved studying a group of students at a music conservatory in Europe. The students all had the goal of being professional musicians with a classical orchestra, hopefully as a featured soloist. Some went on to reach their goal of being a featured player with a prestigious orchestra, while others became general orchestra members, and others went on to be high school and college music teachers. So what differentiated who reached their goal and who didn't? So what Ericsson discovered was that it wasn't a matter of innate skill or talent or IQ, but how they practiced that made all the difference. Ericsson and his fellow researchers found that across a wide range of activities, whether physical, cognitive, or a combination of the two, how you practice makes all the difference. The top performers in every field use some form of deliberate practice. In my experience, deliberate practice is the most effective way to accelerate the acquisition of skills. So what is deliberate practice? Deliberate practice has 6 key elements, the first of which is having clearly defined goals and objectives. Every training session should have a purpose. It isn't just a matter of putting the time in. Ericsson refers to practice without clear goals as naive practice. Sitting around strumming on your guitar is not going to make you the next Eric Clapton. The next element is being willing to work outside of your comfort zone. And this isn't something that comes easily for most of us. Nobody wants to make mistakes or to look foolish, but it's essential for making progress. Adaptability is another important concept in deliberate practice. And we've all experienced what happens during physical training. If you go to the gym or the CrossFit box and you do the same routine every day, you'll get to a certain level of fitness and then you'll just plateau. If, on the other hand, you change up your routine, you're adding weight to your sets and reps, you continue to make gains. And there's a fine line between training that's too easy and training that overwhelms and discourages a student. Which brings us to the next element of deliberate practice, feedback. Deliberate practice involves feedback in adjusting your efforts in response to that feedback. Early on in training, most of that feedback will come from a teacher or a coach. It isn't necessary to be an expert to be a good coach. In fact, many expert performers make terrible coaches, and you only have to look to professional sports to see examples of great athletes that failed miserably as coaches. A good coach can monitor your progress, point out problems, and provide confirming and corrective feedback. Over time, experienced students learn to monitor themselves, recognize their mistakes, and adjust their training accordingly. Deliberate practice is deliberate. It requires a person's full attention and focus. Shorter, focused training sessions are far superior to longer, less focused training. The last principle is the creation of effective mental models. Mental models are mental representations of how things work out in the real world. They make it possible to monitor how you're doing in practice, but even more important, how you're doing in the real world. An example of a mental model that most of us can relate to is our understanding of fire dynamics, building construction, and firefighting tactics at a structure fire. In this example of a fire in an apartment building, if your mental representation isn't particularly accurate or robust, you might apply the same tactics for this event as we did for the previous example of the two-story apartment fire. Here we have a fire in what's commonly referred to as a lookout basement. Stretching a line directly through side alpha means going down a riser of stairs directly into the exhaust path of the fire, putting you and your crew at an unnecessary risk. Based on the fire dynamics and building configuration, resetting the fire from the exterior prior to making the interior push makes more sense. The ability to read the critical factors, recognize the situation, and react appropriately depends on sound mental models. Now, I have a lot of examples to show the effectiveness of deliberate practice, but this one's especially relevant due to the compressed time frames we had to work with. About 8 years ago, a couple of Albuquerque Fire Department captains, Paul Dow and Sean Frazier, both of whom I respect, asked me if I could assist them to prepare for the assessment center portion of their promotional test for battalion chief. They'd already taken a written exam that counted for 50% of their overall score, and the assessment center would account for the remaining 50%. Captain Dow had the top score, and Captain Frazier was 7th on the list after the written exam. They both felt a lot of pressure to do well on the assessment center portion of the test. They both wanted to get promoted, and Captain Frazier really needed to ace the assessment in order to place high enough on the promotional list to assure getting promoted. They had just 3 weeks to prepare for the assessment center. The assessment center consisted of 4 parts. There was an informal presentation, an in-basket exercise, an employee counseling role play, and the last part of it was going to be an emergency response scenario. I'll focus on how we prepared for the emergency response scenario, but we used similar techniques to prepare for the other exercises. The fire problem is the one part of an assessment center that seems to cause the most anxiety for candidates. If you flunk the in-basket, you can always say, well, I'm an operations person, I'm not really good with paperwork. It's a lot tougher to rationalize if you bomb the fire problem. So the first thing we did was create a scoring sheet based on the knowledge, skills, and abilities that were being assessed. For the emergency response scenario, these included scene management, decision-making, situation awareness, tactical knowledge, and oral communications. Since this was a battalion chief assessment, we knew the problem wasn't going to be a simple house fire. So we focused on the types of incidents that we thought they were most likely to see. Things like apartment complexes, large commercial occupancies, and strip mall fires. Before I ran them through a series of problems, I ran through a fire problem myself to model the desired behaviors for them. We set the training up as close to the assessment center as would be conducted as we could. While one was the incident commander, the other would rate the performance using the scoring sheet. We then conducted a short debrief and provided feedback. This included what they did right, confirming feedback, as well as what they needed to work on, corrective feedback. We then ran the scenario again, putting that feedback to work. I had them switch positions. The assessor became the IC became the assessor. Each scenario, I ratcheted up the difficulty a notch. We had the fire extend to other parts of the structure. We had reports of trapped victims, conflicting radio reports from crews, always working just above their comfort zone. I only conducted 1 session of emergency response scenarios, but I left them with a dozen simulations to practice with. And the ability to practice on your own and monitor your performance without a coach or teacher present is another important aspect of deliberate practice. After the assessment center, I followed up with them to see how effective they thought the training for the fire problem was. They both had similar experiences in the assessment center. Now, everyone's nervous taking a promotional exam, and especially with outside assessors, and Paul and Sean were no exception. The fire problem turned out to be a fire in the center occupancy of a medium-sized strip mall, and it's something that we had practiced several times. Once the exercise began, and they realized that the test scenario wasn't nearly as difficult as the incidents they had commanded in practice, they were able to relax and focus on running the incident. They both felt confident that they had scored well on the fire problem. When the scores were released, Captain Frazier was number 1 in the assessment center and had the highest score in the fire problem. Captain Dow was 2nd in the assessment and had the highest score in the fire problem. Both were promoted to battalion chief when the promotional list was finally posted. Now, I had the advantage of working with 2 smart, motivated students, so I wasn't too surprised by the results. But the other candidates were just as smart and just as motivated. The difference was how Paul and Sean had trained. So in January of this year, Paul Dow was appointed the Albuquerque Fire Chief, and Sean Frazier is now one of his assistant chiefs. Even though I'm retired, I still have an active relationship with the Albuquerque Fire Department. I manage the department's command training center, and I develop fire simulations for them. One thing that I've worked really hard to include in the company officer and battalion chief assessment certification process is the use of deliberate practice. Providing company officers and battalion chiefs with the opportunity to expand their experience base and develop robust mental models is the key, is critical to effective performance on the fire ground. Deliberate practice is the key to providing that opportunity. One last thing before I go. The exhibit halls open up today, but there's nothing in there that can't wait until after the educational programs are over. Please take advantage of the great classes and instructors that are scheduled for this afternoon. That's my time this morning. I'm Ted Nee. Thank you for your time and attention.